The System of Systems Thinkers is a collaboration between myself and Carolina and Felicia that started during the pandemic when we met. And we were curious about whether systems thinkers could work together more effectively. Uh, Funny question one might ask. Don't systems thinkers work together anyway? And we've been exploring that question primarily through this dialogue series. This is the fourth of the series that we've hosted. The first dialogue in 2025. And we actually just launched the new beginnings of a new website that's good, hosts all of the dialogues from the past series, which you are welcome to explore. And um, we're excited about what's to come in 2025. We are mostly excited about what's happening right now with Julia and maybe potentially Helena. But for now, we're very excited that you're all here, and we want to dive into a little bit of an introduction from Julia, Dr. Julia Kim, about her work.
Thank you, Carrie, and welcome to everyone. It's interesting when you ask why are systems thinkers working together or not working together, and even to start maybe by asking what is systems thinking and why is it different and why is it important in this context. I might start by saying I didn't always consider myself as part of the systems thinking community. I started out very much focused in one sector in health and medicine. I trained as a medical doctor. And in that training, which took place in Canada, the focus is very much on the individual and the patient in front of you. And you're to some extent trying to help them, trying to understand their life and what's causing them to be healthy or not healthy. But very quickly in my training, I came to realize that a lot of the things that make people healthy or not are a little bit upstream. They happen long before the person turns up in the waiting room. And they have to do with things that I think we're very familiar with now around nutrition, safety, housing, education, psychological well-being, stress. And as you go out to other parts of the world, conflict and war and hunger. And on one hand, this was really depressing and disillusioning as a doctor because that's not what you're trained to deal with. And it seems really out of your hands. So it can be really depressing and disempowering. But in my case, it allowed me to connect with a lot of community activists and social medicine practitioners. And it pushed me upstream to be interested in public health and international health. And I ended up, after my medical training, uh, leaving North America to work as a UN volunteer doctor in rural South Africa, and really to be dealing with the HIV pandemic and very high levels of gender-based violence and gender inequality and poverty in rural villages. And it's interesting that that gave me a huge burst of energy to try to understand the systems that create health and well-being. And I think from that, I started asking more questions about why do we see so much inequality? What is the legacy of apartheid? How does that shift the way we look at the health of individuals and communities? And I was really lucky to kind of leap from this rural community in South Africa to New York, where I was involved in global health and the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, which were the set of targets that the UN had before our SDGs, our Sustainable Development Goals. And in that transition to policy and thinking even bigger about what's going on in countries and internationally, I started to understand the importance of research, of interdependence between different sectors. And at that time, I had the chance to meet the then first Prime Minister of Bhutan, Jigme Tinlay, when he came in 2012 to speak about gross national happiness, this idea that a country could measure happiness and well-being as part of their development strategy. So that is really an intriguing example of systems thinking, that you're looking at the economic and social development of a country really holistically and measuring things in a survey not just health and education and living standards, which are obviously really important, but the depth and reach of community networks, community vitality, psychological well-being of people, time use, how much time freedom or time captivity they have, good governance, whether there's corruption or not, whether there's trust in the government. And all these factors weaving together kind of create an environment for well-being, what we might think about as well-being economics. So I think, I wanted to share that story because I don't think you come into the world as a systems thinker. For myself, it's been a learning curve where in trying to be of service in one particular area, I bumped into the limitations of approaching it from just one discipline. And the frustration of not being able to get underneath those layers opened up my mind and my curiosity about what are the larger systems that shape this one area that I'm trying to work. And I have a feeling that, among the people on this call, people who are engaged in different aspects of work, you may be finding similar tensions and similar frustrations and similar questions. And that to me is an invitation to start thinking about systems, to understand what's the underlying network and connectivity that is shaping both the crises that we're facing and possibly pointing us towards some new solutions. So maybe I'll just stop there, Carrie, but I wanted to kind of open up this idea of what is systems thinking and how did I end up kind of getting enmeshed in this kind of work.
That's so amazing. I hadn't known that about you, that you started out as a doctor. Thank you for sharing that with us. What a wonderful introduction. I believe I've understood that Helena is here and able to hear us. Okay, well, we are just, this is perfect timing, Helena, because as you might have heard, Julia was just providing her introduction.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Welcome.
my big plea in thinking about systems is that I'm trying to get everyone to think about the system that we need to change to reduce emissions, to reduce poverty, to reduce and prevent the breakdown of democracy. And we're talking about an interlinked global economic system. And it's banks as well as other giant corporations that have been systematically freed of any regulations and basically of any taxes. Ever since the Second World War, a system was brought in that wanted to integrate economic activity across the world. And a lot of the politicians who sat down at Bretton Woods after the Second World War to set up the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT, a General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, those people were well-intentioned. Many of them. Their motivation was, how can we avoid another world war? How can we avoid another depression? And the idea was we will integrate all economic activity. What that ended up being in reality was that American intelligence was helping to ensure that economies would open up to essentially American and other Western giant banks and corporate interests to allow complete freedom to move in and out, extract resources, sell whatever they like, reduce any control on money. So I really believe that we would be extremely happy to know that there is a relatively simple solution to our problems today, as something that would almost overnight start a journey of reducing the incredible waste in the global economy. We need to know that every day food is imported and exported. That means the US exports as much beef as it imports. The UK exports as much butter and milk as it imports. Why? Because in that long distance trade, it extracts money to the top. As it happens, this system has gone along with rejecting the wisdom of systems thinkers like Rachel Carson, who had very clearly shown how reductionist science had become, how dangerously reductionist it had become in the 60s. She's pointing out, DDT, we think we can kill some insects we don't like, but actually we harm ourselves, we harm the rest of life because everything is interconnected. That's the essence of systems thinking, is that recognition of the inextricable interconnectedness of everything in the living world. Now, so I'm not sure now how many more minutes I have, but my very big picture approach to this is born of having had the opportunity to live and work for many, many years, particularly in Ladakh, but also in Bhutan over a 5-year period in the 80s. But my eyes were open at first in Ladakh, or Little Tibet, where this part of Western Tibet, which belonged to India, had not been colonized, and like Bhutan, was still functioning as its own political and economic unit, essentially with people not self-reliant, but community-reliant, and with trade in the region. And I had never experienced happier, healthier people. There was no unemployment, there was no poverty. It was not paradise in life. Nothing is perfect, but it was incredibly peaceful, harmonious, and ecologically sustainable. Pollution, as we know it, didn't exist. And most of the illnesses that are now threatening the younger generation, including cancer and heart disease, obesity, didn't exist. So there's a lot for us to learn when we go back and look at cultures and the evidence that is provided by many of the earlier travelers that things did work much, much better. There's a lot of evidence, and that led the economist Schumacher, E.F. Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful. It was his visit to Burma in the 60s that opened his eyes to the fact that his economic theories were simply wrong. And he had to rethink everything virtually, and wrote this important book, Small is Beautiful. So I think I've probably already overdone in terms of time. But there are basically two major messages from Ladakh, or Little Tibet, where I lived for many years. Actually, I've been spending over the last 45 years, I was out there every year. And in the early days, I was there for half of every year. I spoke the ancient Tibetan dialect fluently. And the key lessons that came from that was the vital importance of smaller economic units. Smaller is beautiful, smaller is more efficient. When it comes to farming, when it comes to the provision of basic needs, there is no doubt that smaller, diversified production units are more efficient. They produce more per acre, more per unit of water. And the smaller scale linked to much more holistic experiential knowledge, systems understanding, but systems understanding informed by experience. That's what I see as key. And I'm delighted to have been helping to start particularly local food economies and localization initiatives around the world. I've just come back from Tasmania with some wonderful grassroots project, mainly led by women, who are starting particularly around the fundamentals of how we care for the soil, how we grow our food, and how we care for each other. So they're bringing back more community-based, localized, human-scale ways of giving birth, of dying in community, of singing in community, of swapping seeds, of starting local food initiative. And these are proliferating around the world, and they give me, the greatest sense of hope, and particularly when, as we are doing, they are linked to the more localized, land-based intergenerational community fabric in the so-called global south. So that's what our work is about in Local Futures, is bridging, if you like, the ancient local with the new local. And everything changes. Neither can Ladakh and Bhutan stay exactly as they were, and they never did. They evolved and changed, but in deep resonance with their interdependence with life, in deep experiential systems knowledge of the interdependence of things. So they changed more slowly. They didn't come in with genetic engineering or nuclear power with no idea of what to do with the waste or the toxic side effect. So this slower, more holistic approach to life, we can learn from the traditional and we can bring that into the future. And everywhere, things will be different, things will change. But are we going to support a techno-economic top-down change, or are we going to support a life-informed bottom-up change? That to me is the big question.
That is a great question. So, Julia, I know you probably can respond to that question. And also, I'm just curious, as coming from the perspective that you came from, after working on the Millennium Development Goals and arriving in the field of systems thinking. I mean, that's some years ago now. I'm wondering how your perspectives might have evolved since then.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's significant that Helen and I both kind of were exposed very much to communities that were immersed in a tradition that was deeply infused with spirituality and nature, and in some ways protected geographically, politically from instant globalization. And that wall is not permeable and it's influencing now. But it gave these countries a bit of a head start in being able to chart their own vision and to be able to sustain ways of living that were grounded in local wisdom. And that local wisdom is very different from the technological know-how that Helena was referencing. It's an understanding of who you are, of who we are as human beings embedded in community with each other, but with a natural world, both visible and invisible, in which we're a tiny part. So that automatically brings a certain sense of place in the world, and it sort of has a tamponing down of the aggression and egotism that is characterizing the GDP-driven corporate capitalist culture that we're now beginning to see some of the effects of. So coming from the United Nations in New York, and in some ways what would be envisioned as the epitome of that post-World War global structure that was meant to be shifting us into a more positive vision, I would say one of the things that I learned was that the inner wisdom aspect, the inner dimensions of systems change was not very visible there. I'm not saying it wasn't part of the individuals who came to United Nations from many parts of the world, but there was not much discussion of the values, the vision, the human qualities that are required to usher in the kinds of changes that we're talking about. So you can see a lot of policies, technology, and good ideas, but without the mindset and the commitment and the understanding of what it takes from us to move into a more positive future, my concern is that we just keep reproducing different versions of an extractive economy or of having power struggles with different regions of the world without actually seeing ourselves as one being on this planet, as one living system. So I think what is really piquing my curiosity these days is how we bring those worlds together. So I'm a member of the Club of Rome, which is very much involved in systems thinking and trying to address the complex global problems that we're facing. And I think there's very much an understanding that it requires both an outer technological transformation of society, and that includes technology, science, research, policies, governments, and also a consciousness shift, a way that we re-educate, or in some cases unlearn, certain beliefs and mindsets that drive the kind of societies that we then design. And I think what Helena and I also have in common is we're paying attention to this growing interest in Indigenous wisdom and in the ways of seeing the world that are not very much informed by our Western educational rationalist worldview. And I think when those two come together, the possibility of thinking outside the box becomes much greater. But it does require a kind of curiosity and ability to listen, an ability to not jump at the latest technological shiny toy as our solution, and a kind of humbleness, a recognition that we don't have all the answers, and a willingness to ask the right questions, which are often difficult questions. One of those questions I think that I encounter when I come back from a place like Bhutan to Canada, which is where I'm living much of the time now, are questions about what is a good life? What do we need in order to be happy? And I think there's a lot of messaging on social media, marketing, and advertising that tells us that we need to buy more, we need to shop more, that the sign of a good economy is that the GDP is going up. And meanwhile, I can see that inequality is growing. There's more homelessness. There's less trust between people. And those things are not seen as part of well-being. How do we bring that into an economy, into a culture? So I think Bhutan has been playing a leading role in asking, are we measuring the right things? Are we just tracking GDP? Are we just looking at economic measures as an indication of how well a country is going? Or should we be looking at other things, at measuring the social, the natural world, the spiritual, as ways of giving us a sense of whether we're going in the right direction? So maybe I'll pause there, but just to say that there's a lot of resonance, I think, with what Helena's been sharing.
Yeah, and I think in talking about GDP, I think we need to make it clear that it's actually a measure of commercialization. This means literally that if we get ill with a long-term illness, have to have chemotherapy regularly or drugs for years and years, that's good for GDP. If we stay healthy and plant a garden at home and eat that food without shopping to buy food, that's bad for GDP. That's an unpatriotic thing to do. Now, really, if we get robbed, so we have to buy a new television, a new car, whatever, that's also good for GDP. If the water is so polluted, we have to buy it in bottles, it's good for GDP. So I would argue that there are two levels here now as we think about systems change. One of them is I'm urging people to think about the bigger policies around, particularly economic policy, that has translated into handing over political power to an interlinked empire of corporations and banks. And it's been invisible. It's not been a secret. Trade treaties that have given corporations more and more power and the power to sue government if governments do anything that inhibit their profit. Governments are signing in black and white, yes, yes, we won't do anything that will do that. And so some years ago, when Germany decided to phase out nuclear power after Fukushima, a Swedish nuclear power company sued Germany for 4 billion. So the German government has to pay a Swedish company 4 billion. Right now, one of the more outrageous of these ISDS clauses, they're called, which stands for Investor State Dispute Settlements. Now, an Australian uranium company is suing Greenland for 10 times its GDP for 11 billion. Because they decided that they don't want to have uranium mining anymore because they worry about the pollution. So there is a clarity that we can have if we're willing to look clearly and compassionately at this corporate world as something that is simply not compatible with any kind of systems thinking or any kind of democratic or genuinely ecological development path. So we have to look at what has happened to give these giant corporations so much power. Why does that also mean that we see billionaires heading towards becoming trillionaires. And we're seeing it all over the world. This is not just a phenomenon now of white men in Europe. This is, Asia's richest Ambani family now wanting to use Bhutan's water to create a sort of Google in Asia, in Bhutan. The combination of these giant corporations with high technology, and essentially the most powerful corporations today are those that are either invested in or making use of AI. Algorithms have already supported the growth of a financial casino that is fundamentally immoral as a structure, to have some young men sitting on the other side of the world speculating on our lives, our mortgages. We saw in 2008 that the global financial market needed regulation, but we were told by Obama, no, too big to fail. That is probably the central issue. They are too big to sustain life. They are too big to allow for any kind of democracy. And there's no reason at all why, if citizens wake up, we could not start regulating and taxing global corporations. I would argue, as a political trajectory with systems thinking, that's what we should be talking about. But I feel so privileged in having experienced in Ladakh how fundamental deep community is to our mental health and well-being, how fundamental a slower pace, a more meditative and spiritual approach to life, how fundamental that is to our inner well-being, and how that in turn is reinforced by a deep connection to nature. We haven't been aware of how we've been systematically removed from nature. We've been more and more cut off from the animals, from the plants, from life, and from feeling connected to that. We've also been more and more cut off from each other. And so when I first went back to Sweden, my native country, after living in Ladakh for 2 years, I was suddenly aware of, wow, it makes sense why there's so much depression, so much alcoholism and suicide in this country that's a model of perfection, of modernity, one of the best in terms of supporting women, in terms of supporting being relatively democratic. But it had been wedded to a fossil fuel-based economy that drove people away from the land into high-rise fossil fuel-made buildings. And sometimes you could sit up in your high-rise apartment and literally have no life around you. Sometimes maybe even windows that don't open, as you have in most offices now, and maybe plastic plants, nothing that live. And you know that deep psychological research shows that even having a goldfish can bring back some sense of connection and care and mutuality, and certainly having a dog or a cat even more so. And when you have more connection to other people, that is what is absolutely essential now for young people, to start moving away from what is a growing epidemic of depression among young people, because we're so cut off and strapped into a techno-economic competitive path. And the deep connection that we need wonderfully is emerging of its own. There's an innate longing. There's a light in us that knows we need connection. So everywhere you look, there's a new approach to therapy where the deep connection, AA, by the way, Alcoholics Anonymous, is a primary example of this, and a very, very successful strategy for healing the deepest, most entrenched addiction. So seeing how that's emerging, seeing people sitting in circle, seeing people chanting and singing together, also developing their own DIY vision quests, going out as a group of family to spend time in nature and helping their children to not just play football, but to also experiment with how much they can feel connected to the sea, to the clouds, to the trees. So there's an emergent, what I call relocalization, or I sometimes call it ancient futures trends. It's also a feminine future trend because we're talking about rediscovering the care, the connection, the nurturing, the mutuality that is who we are. It's how we evolved. We would never have survived. We would never be here for all of those tens of thousands of years if we hadn't had those fundamental connected relationships. So that's something that we can start to cultivate and something that we can start to label and promote more actively in terms of personal steps. But I also hope that people will be willing to articulate the bigger picture about what we need for coming together for political change. And that big picture is what I call big picture activism.
Helena, I'm curious, when I hear you describe, oh, there's so much that you just covered, but for Julia, I'm hearing this sort of emergence of a grassroots response, sort of almost an innate longing and re-belonging to one another that's emerging around the world, which I think, a number of us might have witnessed or even part of. Julia, as you listen to Helena, I'm wondering, when we think about the leverage points in the system, are you seeing the same? And or, I'm wondering, how do we get the, sort of the, I don't want to say regulatory, but how do we embed the economics of happiness, well-being economics that you've been developing into at the other level?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a lot that is happening at community level that, as Helena mentioned, it doesn't make the headline news. In many cases, it's a response to just how disempowered and how disconnected people have felt, that they're now starting to find each other. I think there's some organizations that are building on that connectivity and trying to also inform and build awareness around what are the alternatives, because there can be a tendency to just fight and really get burdened by what you don't want without having the power and the vision to imagine what we do want. And I think we know from social psychology that just thinking about the problem isn't enough. We need to also be able to think, what are the possibilities, and begin planting the seeds. I like the word emergent that Helena used. So one organization that I really like to mention that people can check is a Wellbeing Economy Alliance. They're everything from governments in countries that are prioritizing well-being at the highest political level, to individuals and organizations and civil society businesses that are really keen to move towards a new economic model, and finding ways to do that don't have to be confined to one particular country or one model. And I think really, if you were to ask about theory of change, it's not like A leads to B leads to C. What we're talking about now is going to be very unpredictable, because it's both a falling apart of current systems and an emergence of new things. And as we know from falling apart, anything from dropping your cup on the floor, you cannot predict how it's going to land and how it's going to break apart. But in that falling apart, we do know that there's an opportunity for new change and things that aren't incremental. I think a lot of the big shifts in political parties and alliances that we've been seeing in many countries, what they often have in common, although they may not say it, is a resistance to incrementalism and to status quo. So I think when things are disrupting as they are, the chance to try something truly new and paradigm shifting is also possible. And that's exciting. So that's what I'm seeing in groups like Wellbeing Economy Alliance. I think another aspect is something that Helena mentioned, which is what is the kind of inner capacity that you need to engage in this kind of work. And it's an interesting time when we have a lot of neuroscience research looking at things like ancient traditions around meditation and contemplation, and finding the scientific basis by which they may work to increase our resilience and our ability to face these challenges. Dr. Richard Davidson and the Center for Healthy Minds in Madison, Wisconsin, have been producing a lot of very interesting research in that way, and really saying that meditation isn't, in the same way we used to think about going to the gym in order to increase our physical strength and agility, how that used to be something that, was the purview of athletes, is now all of us think about in terms of our health, our exercise, our well-being, and that it used to be a sort of generic, you need to exercise, and now we understand that there's strength building, there's core, there's flexibility, there's endurance, there's different kinds of training. So in the same way, our understanding of the human mind and of resilience is much more refined now because of the neuroscience. So I think Healthy Minds has really kind of crystallized three particular areas that folks can work on to grow their resilience and their inner strength in these times. I think one of them is awareness, just the ability to take in and not be distracted, and to be able to have a meta awareness of what's going on. So that's one practice and one skill to develop. Another one is connection. So as Helena was saying, this ability to be open-hearted, to have a sense of compassion, to not shut down to when you see adversity, when you see somebody who has a different viewpoint from yours. That can also be cultivated. So again, the ancient wisdom practices now coming into the modern realm. And then the third pillar would be insight. So insight into yourself, into the stories that you tend to tell yourself, the backtrack that's often playing in your mind, insight into your role in the world, your insight into how we're connected with nature, as Helena was mentioning, and that these practices are not only for individuals and their well-being, but for those who are on the front lines, activists, people who are working in the context of, climate burnout. These are essential tools, the inner technology we need in order to engage with the complexity that we're finding. So I think in some ways we're really on the cusp of really interesting and exciting times, because these are areas of research and coming together of disciplines that did not exist in the past. I'd really point people towards those resources and groups as well.
Wonderful. So as we kind of come to the last few minutes of the dialogue, I'd love to ask you both, maybe starting with you, Helena, what are you working on currently, and or what are you seeing in the world that gives you the most hope? I mean, you've mentioned some of those things already, but if we could put a more focused lens.
Yeah, well, I'm working currently on a big gathering we're having in Ladakh in the first week of September. I hope people might think of coming. And I have to explain that the carbon footprint of people like us, women or men too, interested in systems change, is insignificant compared to the carbon footprint of all those pounds of potatoes and beef that are being flown back and forth, and the emissions from global trade, including the tourist trade, are nowhere mentioned. Nowhere mentioned in the COPs, nowhere mentioned in the climate movement. It is absolutely outrageous. So instead, it's just focused on our individual behavior, whether we get into a plane, whether we get into a car. So we have to rethink a lot of these ideas to obviously not go flying hither and thither, for no reason. But if we're coming together to actually try to communicate across the global north and south, to collaborate for meaningful change and to do away with so many misconceptions on both sides. there is still such a lack of understanding in the West or the North about the vital importance of farming and the vital importance of allowing more than 0% of people to be farming on the land. And we're talking about countries where sometimes 50%, even 60% of people are in land-based activities, living on the land. And much more than that, there's in the global south, there's the belief that in the center of the West, New York being the pinnacle, we live a life of constant leisure and infinite wealth. We don't need to do any work. And this romanticization of this urban consumer culture is like a warfare of mental pollution into communities that, as I say, are land-based. And we're talking about billions of people. We're talking about, as I say, 50% of about 50% still in China, in India, in Indonesia, and so on. So it's a very significant number. And won't go into all of that. But the deep dialogue that we're encouraging from people on the ground in those different parts of the world, I think is very important. And so we're very pleased that a couple of years ago we had what we called a Planet Local Summit in Bristol in the UK, supported by the former mayor who had also started a local currency there. And this year it will be in Ladakh in September. We're also working on more films. We've just produced a couple of animations that try to explain how central the trade treaties are and why we need to look to change those as a very strategic lever for reversing what otherwise will be taking us essentially towards a future of fusing humans and technology, a future that is blindly supported by often good and kind people, but people who are so removed from the realities on the ground. They believe growth through global trade is necessary to keep this thing going. We can't slow it down. It's like a bicycle. Everything will crash if we do anything to shift in another direction. We're talking about the possibility of incremental change that could lead to a soft landing, and that would immediately bring benefits to the global population, that would immediately prevent the trajectory where the billionaires become trillionaires and where fewer and fewer people amass more and more essentially artificial money. That's another story. That's part of all of this. But so anyway, I'm getting into the big picture again, and we're involved in, we have a series, actually a webinar series right now called Feminine Futures, where 6 of my colleagues from around the world, from Brazil, from Europe, from around the world, are laying out a vision for a more feminine future coming from different disciplines. So we're trying to create tools that can be used around the world. And they have been. Our film, The Economics of Happiness, our film and my book, Ancient Futures, were translated into more than 40 languages, and they're still being used around the world. So that's our main activity.
Amazing. Thank you. Wonderful. How about you, Julia?
Yeah, a few things that I've touched on. Maybe I'll put some of the links in the chat later on, but Wellbeing Economy Alliance, I think, is a good place for people to start and find out what's happening locally for them and to learn more about well-being economies. I'm still leading programs, international programs at the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan. And there's a group that will be coming with me to Bhutan in April. We do this once or twice a year, and it's a chance to move through the country to really explore what is happening there, to think about how well-being economies could be implemented in your own organization or your own community. And that's in partnership with Small Giants Academy, a group that's based in Australia, which reminds me that Helena and I will both be speaking next week at a conference. It's actually more of a gathering than a conference called the Wisdom and Action Forum in Melbourne. That's being hosted by Small Giants Academy. And that's an ongoing series. I think they had their first last year, and Helena and I will both be there this year. I think there's an interesting free online series of webinars between Dr. Richard Davidson, who I mentioned earlier is doing the neuroscience research on healthy minds, speaking with a really kind of dynamic young Tibetan Buddhist teacher named Mingyur Rinpoche. They're going to be in dialogue starting, I think, this month. And it's called Born to Flourish, How to Thrive in a Challenging World. And I think that might be interesting for folks. I'll see if I can find that link. Again, an online webinar series exploring the inner dimensions of resilience and activism. And then I would also mention Earth for All and the Emerging New Civilizations Initiative, which are parts of the Club of Rome's work, and really looking at some of the large big picture issues that Helena mentioned. What are the kinds of shifts in policy, business, governance, finance that need to happen in order to really bring about big systems change? And Emerging New Civilizations, there's a program called The Fifth Element, which is really looking at how do we live our lives? What is it that's important to us as human beings? What is happening in different parts of the world that we should be paying more attention to? And how do we bring that wisdom into our own lives and our own communities? So that's just a taste at the headline level, and maybe we'll try to put some in the chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. Well, I have many more questions, but we have a break to send everyone to, a breakout that Carolina has organized to explore. I'll let her explain the prompt, but we'll do that for about 6 minutes, and then we'll come back together for some Q&A. And so, Carolina, are we ready to go?
Yes, we are. I'm just dropping now a prompt in the chat, but essentially we're inviting everyone to go a little bit into that place of local hope and to go and think about the examples and share about what change you see happening locally and what are your local sources of hope and inspiration. Just an open question for all of you to share. I'm going to open the rooms now for about 6 minutes, and please enjoy the conversation.
So I guess,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm going to
yeah.
just pause the recording. Welcome back. Good to see you all. We hope you enjoyed that conversation. And we're going to leave a few minutes for reflections and questions for our speakers. And I'm trying to spotlight Helena. Maybe you could do that, Carolina. It doesn't seem to be working for me. There she is. That spotlight. There we go. Okay. If anyone would like to share a short reflection or ask a question, please raise your hand or feel free to put it in the chat. And if I don't see any questions, I'm going to ask some myself. Oh, Felicia, excellent.
Thank you.
Felicia.
I just had a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to, Julia, you mentioned the Millennium Development Goals. And in my previous work, one of the things I was sort of running the flag for was a systems thinking approach to local adoption and adaptation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. And I've also seen the development goals sort of criticized for being sort of hyperlinear. And I've really appreciated the sort of sort of massive workshop that went into the creation of these 17 goals, and the fact that it turned out to be 17. They didn't plan for 17. And, it was it was a global effort of workshops, and input and synthesizing input. And that's how they came up with them. And then I added an 18th in my little local community. What was it? Arts, culture, and community. But I don't know, like, what is your opinion? Are they too linear to have all those little boxes? Is it possible to take a systems approach to the UN SDGs?
Yeah, in some ways, it's almost an impossible task to be able to be that comprehensive at a global level. And I think it's an attempt to put on the radar screen in a way that national governments are accountable what is seen as the priorities. But you are absolutely right. As soon as you start to do that, you start to go into silos and into sectors. And that in turn influences funders and agendas. And that also sets up an unintended kind of competition between those silos. And it's a bit of an inhibiting factor to that kind of systemic cross-sector approach. But I think it's still important for what I said at the beginning, that the United Nations is really at its best and its worst when it's working at the level of nation states. I mean, that's its DNA. But it does hold up a kind of a global set of targets that countries are accountable to report on. I think the problem is it does set up a whole industry and a whole kind of machinery around getting to those goals. And it doesn't necessarily allow countries to fine tune and to, as you did, add an 18th where it was necessary. And even within the 17 goals, there's a kind of hierarchy among the ones that are kind of sexy and easy to fund and the ones that people don't want to touch. And it doesn't allow one to really question the larger system upon which the goals are set, which comes back to what Helena has been talking about, this global architecture, the economic and political system, which in some ways is now unhealthily fraying at the edges. So I don't, at this particular time, I think globalism is important. We see a lot of fractioning out, a lot of countries that I won't name any names now, but are going into a very protectionist stance, which can be very dangerous. But I think there is a lot of room for thinking outside the box that isn't linked to one particular framework. Yeah, but thanks for the question.
I just want to add there that it's really important that we distinguish between global collaboration and global trade. What we need to look at is that global trade, almost without any exception, involves already giant global corporations and bringing benefit to them. So international trade is not really about trade between countries. It's not about businesses in America or businesses in the UK producing things that are traded. It's this stranglehold of big global corporations that are dominating and can only impose monoculture on the ground. And so there's a fundamental problem with global trade almost from the outset, from the very foundation of this economy, that it imposed the giant wheat fields, the giant cotton plantations, the tea plantations. From the outset, it was inherently anti-ecological. And unfortunately, the left, political left, was not deeply in tune with the fact that the real economy is living Mother Gaia with all her complexity. The living economy is the earth, and everything we need comes from that. So without that foundation of ecological literacy, most of economic activity has grown more and more and more destructive. And I also just want to tell you, when I started my work in the 70s and even in the 80s, we got funding from governments like the Swedish government, the Canadian, I think even some from the US, German. At that time, those governments did not have any language about biodiversity, ecology, cultural diversity, nothing. they were actually more clearly wedded to a fossil fuel path. Now they have all that language with the help of the UN, but in practice, the neoliberal system, Julia, I don't think it's fraying. I'm afraid that it's stronger than ever, and it's responsible for the polarization in the social media. It's responsible for very frightening divisiveness, and it thrives on war. That global economy, we know, structurally thrives on war, real war. So, and it's continuing out with the help of AI. So there's a big alarming bell to be rung to really wake up to that and not act out of fear. And as you were saying, Julia, I completely agree. This is not just about resisting that, it's about making visible this emergence that is coming, making visible the huge change in cultural values that's going on as people are more and more consciously longing for connection to the earth, respecting indigenous culture, etc., etc. So very long answer.
Thank you. No, very
was-
nice. Very good. Yeah. I'd like to call on Isabella.
Hello, thanks so much. And hi, Helena. I think the last time we saw each other was at Schumacher College for the Feminine Futures course, which actually like ties in a bit with what we spoke about in terms of this prompt, what change is happening locally, because, unfortunately, I think the last few examples, with Schumacher College being one of them, and then a few others in East London where I'm based, where local community hubs are actually just under threat of being shut down constantly, and either they're just living under that threat, and obviously it brings like a real pressure and negativity to the space, and resistance to the space, or they've been shut down with some like protests and resistance, and it's due to funding most of the time. But then why there isn't subsidies or support available for these places is another question. So that's kind of what I'm noticing, unfortunately, whether that's UK specific due to just like how the UK economy is going. But at the same time, if I want to pick up one local source of hope and inspiration, not plugging anything here because I'm not associated with it, but there's something happening with this sort of community that I think is linked to like solar punk. If anyone's heard of this school of solar punk or this sort of subculture, I think it's linked with maybe a bit of the crypto space, but yeah, that's probably the only thing that I've seen where people are actually coming together with alternative creative solutions and with themes of regenerative energy, regenerative finance, self-governance, self-sustainability, etc. So let's see how that goes. But then that ecosystem is again a very digital web space, higher level rather than on the ground, local and physical. So I feel like local physical places are struggling quite a bit. If anyone has any thoughts or reflections or tips to save those, I'd be all ears.
How about either of our speakers?
Where are you now, Isabella?
Unlike my background, I'm actually in East London, in the UK.
Okay. You look like you're in Byron Bay, where I am.
I wish. So,
I don't have, I don't know if either of you have a direct response to how to support struggling local initiatives or what you're seeing.
Yes, I mean, I do. I'm definitely seeing local initiatives struggling and lots of good things struggling, and many of which had been, quite successful attempts at protecting a forest or protecting, like in Tasmania, where I just was, where apparently the Green Party started there. I didn't even know that, but in protecting their rivers and forests, and the system is actually very strong right now because our governments, left and right, have gone along with this fundamental idea that global trade is the only way to grow the economy. And that means, so we're seeing a lot of local initiatives suffering, and yet I was so heartened to hear just one example now in Tasmania, a woman who started a local food box scheme where on a small diversified farm, they delivered boxes to a community that was in touch with them and that wanted to support this type of healthy, diversified agriculture that's good for their health, good for the planet. And she said it was really hard. And now, after 5 years, she's left it. But she said someone else has stepped up and is still living on. And having helped to start local farmers markets, local food initiatives now for more than 45 years, I'm really happy to report that most of them still survive the onslaught, but they need much more conscious support. And I should have said this earlier because I do want to encourage people to focus on local food as one of the most central areas to strategically become part of that emergence as a structural and very real economic and even political transition. These local food initiatives are much more important than people realize. And they're still continuing to proliferate. So I'm definitely not giving up hope. Ultimately, it is nature that is our reality, and working with her, supporting genuine diversification and supporting community, people coming together. These are necessary, they're happening, and they are creating strength and health and real power from the bottom up. But what's missing more than anything, I would say, is that big picture activism. We need more funding to make visible that human scale, ecological, spiritually founded way of doing things. And we need to, at the same time, make it clear what are the tentacles of this huge techno-economic system that, as I said, is also responsible for this mental pollution in the global south, making people feel inferior and backward. By the way, also making farmers in the West feel backward and stupid, and farmers who were pressured to invest in more technology, meaning more fossil fuel use, more energy use, more chemicals, more fertilizer, now are suddenly told, we're removing all of that. We need to be there to work with those farmers to show them how much they will gain by shifting to more diversification, organic, healthy agriculture. We need to be part of a lobby for healthy agriculture and working as much as possible with farmers. But there is an urgent need to have citizens, consumers. We're 99% in the industrialized world to become aware of this food and farming issue.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to invite you, thank you for that, and thanks for the questions. And we are going to transition now as a way to informally close out the session with a beautiful piece of music from Julia, who is going to play on her violin. And then we'll wrap up with a couple of closing words when she finishes. Thank you, Julia.
Maybe just to preface this by saying that the kind of despair, burnout, lack of resources that people are feeling at that level of activism and of gathering, I've been bringing in more music, sound, and meditation into these groups as a way of keeping our spirits going and a way of encouraging us to envision, keep our eyes on the vision ahead, not give up. So I'd invite you all, wherever you are, to think about who is your community, what is the vision that you're holding dear, and just to allow yourself to connect to the sound and to the fact that what we are moving and working through is emergent. And I'm going to be improvising. I don't know what I'm going to be playing, but I will be trying to reflect out the feeling of our conversation. Sorry, I'm just trying to switch to the sound for musicians on. Are you able to do that from your side?
It says it's on.
It says it's on.
Okay, good.
Oh, they have a different sound.
Different sound.
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
That was so
That
beautiful.
was so beautiful.
I'm hearing an echo. Okay, we gotta turn the original sound off. Okay. Thank you, Julia. What a gift. What a beautiful way to close us out. I have a lot more hope in my heart. Thank you all again for participating and bearing witness to this historic dialogue. Actually, Julia and Helena have never been publicly in conversation together until now. And so we're very grateful that we were able to invite them to be in dialogue together. And thank you both, Helena and Julia, for participating in the series. And we will be announcing our next dialogue over email and on the socials in the coming weeks. And we'll probably have 3 more dialogues this year. So thank you for joining us, to all of you. And I just want to call a special shout out, Dave, to sorry, don't mean to single you out, but this dialogue series is for all people of all genders. And we very much welcome the presence of men and people of all genders. We are trying to lift up the voices of women in a world that are often too crowded out by men's voices, but we want men to hear these dialogues. So thank you for attending. And anything else that we need to share from our end? Nope. Okay. Well, we wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. And we'll stay on for just a moment in case anyone has questions or comments for us. But thank you to Dr. Julia Kim and Helena Norberg-Hodge. And we wish you all very well.
Thank you
I
so
guess
much.
I would also just like to say that I so agree with Julia that music and singing, also singing together, is something that we did our entire evolution, and everyone sang, everyone joined in. It wasn't about being perfect and being a star and others listening. It was actually this amazing, fundamentally spiritual connection that happens when we sing and make music together. And all spiritual traditions had it, so it's another thing that's beginning to emerge. But if we can make that more conscious and help people enjoy that and have the courage, as I'm having the courage tomorrow to start a sort of chanting simple song thing here at my house. I don't dare to lead. I'm still too self-conscious, but I think really we can all sing, and it's a real joy. And sound healing has also proven to be deeply effective for healing.
Indeed. So thank you for healing us with your sound, Dr. Julia Kim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
More in Melbourne. I assume you'll be playing in Melbourne.
Yes, I'll be bringing the violin with me to Melbourne for this Wisdom in Action Forum. And just to echo what you were saying, Helena, it takes a bit of courage. I used to keep these parts of my life separate, but I see that it's really needed now. And so I bring out the violin. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.